early morning hours of October 7th, 2023, the world changed for Gaza. A sudden eruption of violence, triggered by a deadly assault from Hamas militants into Israeli territory, shattered the uneasy calm that had hung over the region for months. The Israeli government's response was swift, expansive, and unrelenting. Airstrikes thundered across the enclave, targeting what were declared to be militant sites, but often striking far more: homes, apartment buildings, markets, mosques, and schools. In a matter of hours, Gaza was thrust into a war of historic proportions, one that would not merely devastate its infrastructure, but redefine its place in global consciousness as a living wound. Over the next days and weeks, the scale of the operation broadened beyond any recent memory. What Israel framed as a campaign to dismantle Hamas quickly transformed into an all-encompassing siege of the Gaza Strip. The bombardments, initially focused on northern Gaza and Gaza City, expanded into southern strongholds: Khan Yunis, Deir el-Balah, and eventually Rafah, the last bastion for more than 1 million displaced civilians who had already been pushed from one demolished neighborhood to another. The concept of a safe zone dissolved. There was, as thousands of residents attested, no place left to run. By January 2025, 3 months into the war, over 46,000 Palestinians had already been confirmed dead. More than half were believed to be women and children. Entire families were erased in single airstrikes, leaving no survivors to tell their stories. Hospitals, already fragile after years of blockade, were turned into graveyards as fuel and medical supplies ran out. The wounded lay in corridors, in tents, on sidewalks. Many without anesthesia, others without hope. Rescue crews, few and under-resourced, pulled bodies from the ruins with bare hands, often forced to bury the dead in mass graves without identification. As the war ground on, Gaza's physical annihilation became inseparable from its humanitarian collapse. Israel's siege, blocking nearly all entry of food, water, medicine, and fuel, quickly escalated into a catastrophe unlike any seen in recent decades. Aid organizations, including the United Nations and Doctors Without Borders, warned that famine was not only possible, but inevitable. By mid-2024, Gaza had effectively been cut off from the outside world, and the images that leaked out were agonizing: skeletal children too weak to cry, mothers feeding babies sugar water to keep them alive another day, and elderly people wasting away in silence. According to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, by late 2024, over 93% of Gaza's children were facing acute food insecurity. Nearly 1 million children were starving. Then came a pause. A ceasefire brokered in January 2025 that offered a brief illusion of hope. Between January 19th and March 17th, a temporary halt in bombardments allowed limited aid to enter. Convoys rolled in from Egypt, and the UN began to re-establish food distribution centers in Rafah and central Gaza. And yet, even during that fragile pause, at least 170 people were killed in sporadic clashes and drone strikes. Another 2,200 died from injuries sustained in prior months or because their access to hospitals, oxygen, dialysis machines, or essential medicine was non-existent. As one medic in Khan Yunis said, "The ceasefire gave us the time to count our dead, not to save the living." On March 18, 2025, the ceasefire collapsed. What followed was one of the deadliest phases of the war. Israel resumed its bombardments with intensified fury. Within the next 2 months, at least 3,613 Palestinians were confirmed killed. Nearly 1,000 more bodies were pulled lifeless from the rubble, many having died under collapsed buildings days or even weeks prior. Gaza's death toll, as of May 22, 2025, stands at 53,762 confirmed, though estimates suggest the real number could be significantly higher, perhaps reaching 60,000 when accounting for those never recovered or recorded. Amid this carnage, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took to international platforms to explain his vision for the future of Gaza, a vision that has been described by critics, including former Israeli leaders and major international organizations, as a blueprint for permanent occupation and ethnic cleansing. Netanyahu's post-war plan, revealed during a rare press conference in early 2025, went beyond military objectives. It detailed a political, territorial, and demographic restructuring of Gaza that would leave Palestinians with neither sovereignty nor security. According to his proposal, Israel would retain full military control over the entire strip, eliminate all remnants of Hamas governance, and establish what he described as security zones and civilian containment areas. These would effectively be internment camps where displaced Palestinians would be relocated, surveilled, and heavily restricted in movement and communication. One of the most alarming aspects of this plan is its overlap with a former U.S. proposal, widely known as the Trump-era Gaza relocation plan. Though shelved after global outrage, the blueprint called for the voluntary, or forced, resettlement of Gaza's population to third-party countries such as Egypt or Jordan, a plan widely criticized as ethnic cleansing under international law. Netanyahu's recent revival of this strategy, cloaked in the language of security necessity, has prompted outcry from human rights organizations across the globe. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees have all warned that such forced transfers violate the Fourth Geneva Convention and could constitute crimes against humanity. And yet, while political leaders debated, civilians continued to die, not only from bombs but from hunger. The siege strategy adopted by Israel in late 2024 and early 2025 included strict limitations on food convoys, fuel deliveries, and humanitarian access. The World Food Program warned in March 2025 that over 500,000 Gazans were facing famine-level conditions. The so-called starvation plan, as many journalists have come to label it, was not the accidental byproduct of war, but a calculated policy. Israeli officials were recorded stating that no aid should enter Gaza that would allow Hamas to rearm, and as a result, even basic essentials were considered contraband. In one intercepted radio transmission, an Israeli military official described the tactic as economic pressure to accelerate the population's surrender. Inside Gaza, this economic warfare manifested as the slow death of a population. Humanitarian convoys, when they were allowed to enter at all, were forced through a labyrinth of inspections. Trucks waited for days at Kerem Shalom, only to have cargo rejected for reasons as arbitrary as containing water purification tablets, gauze, or baby formula. Aid workers were detained, some harassed or even injured in the chaos of distribution. Meanwhile, the average Gazan queued in bread lines that stretched miles. Makeshift bakeries operated without electricity, grinding grain by hand, and charging astronomical prices for a few pieces of flatbread. Mothers fed their children one meal every 2 days, often consisting of rice soaked in stagnant water or dried leaves boiled in seawater. Reports from Doctors Without Borders and the Palestinian Red Crescent painted a horrific picture. Starvation was not a forecast, but a reality. Inside field hospitals and bombed-out clinics, doctors documented a spike in deaths from dehydration, anemia, and untreated infections. Amputations were conducted with kitchen knives and minimal anesthetic. Newborns died for lack of incubators. Premature babies were kept alive by the body heat of nurses who wept while whispering lullabies over dying infants. In one of Gaza's last functioning maternity centers, a midwife reported that stillbirths had become so frequent that many were buried nameless, wrapped in torn plastic sheeting. It was not just the collapse of a health system, it was the collapse of a future. As the siege intensified, voices from around the world grew louder. International condemnation poured in, from global citizens and heads of state alike. The Secretary General of the United Nations described Gaza as a graveyard for children. The head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom, nearly broke down during a press conference, his voice trembling as he begged for mercy. "This is not just a humanitarian crisis," he said. "This is a moral catastrophe. Gaza is not a war zone. It is a place of systematic annihilation." Protests erupted across Europe, Asia, and North America. In Paris, over 200,000 people marched in silence, holding photos of missing Palestinian children. In London, Trafalgar Square was flooded with demonstrators calling for an end to the siege and for Netanyahu to be tried for war crimes. Even within Israel, cracks appeared in the facade of national unity. In Tel Aviv, thousands of Israelis took to the streets demanding an end to the war, the resignation of Netanyahu, and early elections. Among the protesters were families of hostages taken by Hamas in the initial attack, people who had at first supported military action but now called for dialogue and diplomacy over devastation. But the government remained resolute. Netanyahu, speaking from Jerusalem, dismissed all criticism as morally bankrupt and naive. He accused the global community of falling for Hamas propaganda and asserted that Israel had the right to defend itself at all costs. In a particularly incendiary speech, he outlined his vision for a post-Hamas Gaza, a region that, according to him, must be fully demilitarized, depopulated of radicals, and administrated by an Israeli-led coalition. He reiterated his commitment to complete victory, even as satellite images showed neighborhoods reduced to dust and thermal scans revealed no signs of life in once bustling refugee camps. Meanwhile, the political fallout extended far beyond Israel's borders. The European Union launched a formal review of its cooperation agreement with Israel, citing possible violations of human rights clauses. The United Kingdom paused all free trade talks and threatened sanctions if humanitarian access was not restored immediately. Canada, once a close ally of Israel, publicly condemned the expansion of settlements and the proposed relocation of Gaza's population, calling it a crime against dignity and international law. At the United Nations, a resolution demanding a full ceasefire passed with overwhelming support, with the United States abstaining, drawing anger from both sides. In Washington, the Biden administration faced mounting pressure. While initially offering firm support to Israel, the tone began to shift as images of starving children dominated headlines and congressional offices received hundreds of thousands of letters, emails, and phone calls. Protests broke out on university campuses, in federal buildings, and outside the White House. Jewish American groups split sharply, some rallying in support of Israel's right to self-defense, others demanding an end to what they called a genocidal campaign. For the first time in decades, the alliance between Washington and Tel Aviv appeared strained. Inside Gaza, hope was no longer found in speeches or diplomacy. It lived in small acts of survival. In Rafah, where over 1 million people had taken shelter in tents and under tarps, children painted on scraps of cardboard, sketching what they remembered of home: a door, a cat, a pomegranate tree. A volunteer teacher in a makeshift school taught the alphabet using pebbles and sticks. A father built a swing from plastic bags and rope so his daughter could feel joy for 5 minutes a day. Amid the horrors, humanity refused to be extinguished. But tragedy remained constant. In mid-May, one of the final standing hospitals in central Gaza, Al-Auda, was hit by a missile strike. The explosion killed dozens, including 2 surgeons and a journalist from Al Jazeera. That same day, a convoy of evacuees heading south was targeted near the Salah al-Din highway, a scene of carnage that left 45 dead, including 17 children. Israel claimed militants were using the convoy for cover. Survivors told a different story, one of desperation, chaos, and miscommunication. The truth, like much in this war, was buried with the dead. By late May, Gaza was no longer just a war zone. It was a moral indictment. The sheer scale of destruction, the intensity of suffering, and the global paralysis in the face of such calamity raised urgent questions. What happens when peace is no longer seen as possible? When destruction is live-streamed, tweeted, analyzed, but no longer shocks the conscience? When international law is invoked but not enforced? The death toll, 53,762 confirmed, with thousands still under rubble, was not just a number. It was a collective failure, a reflection not only of military strategy, but of political apathy, media fatigue, and human indifference. In Gaza, mothers began recording goodbye videos for their children. Children buried their parents. Doctors chose which patients to treat and which to let die. Boys who once played football now dug graves. Girls who dreamed of becoming teachers now dreamed only of living to the next day. The world watched. Some cried, some protested, most scrolled past. And as the final bombs fell on Rafah, the question remained, what lesson will history draw from this? Kindly subscribe the channel for more stories.